Ah, yes, Karsus. Karsus was perhaps the most powerful wizard who ever lived. The child who would become a god, the elves called him, and he tried. With a spell of his own devising, he endeavored to usurp in one fell swoop the power of the goddess of magic. Imagine what it must have felt like to be a god, to know yourself to be untouchable, to be mistaken. The ancient empire of Netherese is one of the most important history topics in all of Forgotten Realms lore. In fact, that quote from the beginning is actually from Gale in Baldur's Gate 3, talking about one of the most powerful Netherese wizards of all time. And since I just mentioned Gale, Gale's origin description reads as, a Netherese destruction orb beats in his chest, counting down to an explosion that can level a city. Now there's also several other ties that the Netherese Empire and Netherese magic have to Baldur's Gate 3, but for spoiler reasons, I'm just going to leave it at that. Big thank you to all channel members and patrons who make this series a possibility. I really do appreciate you guys. Without further ado, let's dive deep into an ancient magical empire that shaped the world of Toril. Long, long ago, many thousands of years before the events in Baldur's Gate 3, a group of humans made their home in the lush lands of the region of Netherese on Phaerimm. The region of Netherese no longer exists in modern-day Forgotten Realms, but its location was within what is now the Anauroch Desert, which is northeast of where the city of Baldur's Gate is located. These humans, which I'll now refer to as the Netherese, proved to be prosperous, and as their nation rapidly grew, it drew the attention of the nearby Ioulaum elves from the high forest to the west of their region. The elves opened up diplomatic ties with the Netherese. They formed an alliance, and actually many of the Netherese began doing work for the elves. The elves were just much more advanced, and working for them provided opportunity for these Netherese humans. The Ioulaum elves were highly skilled in the arts of magic, and they began slowly teaching the Netherese about spellcasting, which in turn made the work that the Netherese were doing much more efficient and of a much higher magnitude. Over time, the Netherese became fixated on learning arcane spells and cantrips, and eventually they got to the point of where they felt like they didn't need to work for the elves anymore. With their newfound magical prowess, they could do everything on their own. Within Netherese, every citizen, even commoners such as maids, were taught the basics of spellcasting. After around 300 years of studying with the elves, the Netherese would end up finding the golden skins of the world serpent, which are now called the Nether Scrolls, in the ruins of an old Sun Elf kingdom called Arivandar. The Nether Scrolls contain the fundamentals to magical theory, and this newfound knowledge gave the Netherese a huge leap forward in spellcrafting. Their power continued to grow, and they became more obsessed than ever with learning and mastering the arcane arts. In minus 3315 DR, one of Netherese's greatest arcanists was born, Ioulaum. A few hundred years later, and do note that some of the Netherese humans were able to slow the effects of aging, Ioulaum created one of the most powerful magical devices ever made, the first ever Mythallar. This device allowed one to access vast amounts of raw magic without draining their own life force. And this would allow one to create quasi-magical items that were powered by these Mythallars, and that's exactly what Ioulaum did. In minus 2954 DR, Ioulaum created the first floating enclave of the Netherese Empire. The Netherese had figured out how to live in the sky. With the Mythallars, they even discovered how to create underwater crystal-domed colonies in the Sea of Fallen Stars, and these colonies became known as Deep Netheril. Over time, several more Mythallars were created, and the Netherese began lifting one enclave into the sky each year. They were creating a kingdom of moving, floating cities, while also maintaining land on the surface of Phaerimm. Netheril was split into High Netheril, where the higher-class noble citizens lived in the safety of the sky, and Low Netheril, which was comprised of the commoners that lived on the surface of Phaerimm. It was a golden age of great magical innovation and overall prosperity for the Netherese Empire. All good things must come to an end, though. As the Netherese cities flourished in the skies, magical residue was left behind and it began to seep into the earth below. This residue would become an affliction for a race of subterranean dwelling creatures called the Phaerimm. The Phaerimm were slowly being destroyed, and they had no choice but to attempt to put an end to the Netherese. In -461 DR, the Phaerimm began draining both life and magic from the planet of Toril and the floating Netherese enclaves, and this in turn not only created barren wastelands that destroyed much of the land that was part of Low Netheril, this draining magic also caused the destruction of 2 of the flying enclaves. These barren wastelands would go on to become the Anauroch Desert in modern-day Forgotten Realms. During this time of magical chaos, Ioulaum abandoned Netheril to escape these life-draining dwellers, and panic spread through the Netherese Empire. This is when a powerful Netherese archmage by the name of Karsus attempted something that would cause unimaginable destruction. This event was known as Karsus's Folly. Karsus was born in -696 DR, long before the war with the Phaerimm. Karsus had a special talent for attaining mastery of spellcraft, and he would go on to create his own enclave called Ioulaum. And he also discovered a powerful form of magic known as heavy magic. Heavy magic had many alterable properties, and it was a physical, vicious type of magic that could take the shape of whatever it touched. When Ioulaum disappeared, Karsus felt it was his duty to save his empire from the Phaerimm, and he would attempt a spell that has never been attempted before. This was a 12th level spell that he would call Karsus's Avatar, and its objective was to steal the divine powers from the Mother of Magic herself, Mistral. The Mother of Magic controls the weave of magic, supplying and regulating magical energy to all, making possible spells and magical effects. If Karsus could steal her power, Netheril would become the most powerful empire the planet of Toril has ever seen, and the Phaerimm certainly wouldn't stand a chance. When Karsus cast the spell, his body swelled with a sudden influx of godly power, and his mind filled with unimaginable knowledge. However, he instantly realized he had made a mistake. Mistral knew exactly what she needed to do, and she sacrificed herself, as she knew it was the only way to save the weave of magic, and in doing so, this also broke contact with Karsus. Her sacrifice caused all magic to briefly cease functioning, killing Karsus and turning his body to stone, and also causing the Mythallars to stop working, which in turn caused the floating magical cities of Netheril to come crashing down to the ground. Moments after her sacrifice, Mistral was reincarnated as Mystra, and Mystra was actually able to save 3 of the flying cities, and she landed them safely on the ground, but the surviving Netherese scattered. Mistra's first priority was to recreate the weave of magic, but this time with new rules for using magic. No longer could a spell above the 10th level of power be able to function. No one could ever again try what Karsus had tried. One story that we cannot leave out, though, is that of the enclave known as Thultanthar, which was ran by an archmage by the name of Telamont Tanthul. Days before Karsus's folly, Telamont managed to shift his entire flying enclave to the plane of Shadow. In modern times, this would be called the Shadowfell plane, which I did do a lore video on a few Sundays ago. While in the plane of Shadow, the catastrophe of Karsus's folly occurred, and Telamont decided to remain in the plane of Shadow with his enclave to maintain what would be the last of the Netherese Empire. One city would not be enough to take on the Phaerimm if he were to return to Phaerun. During this time in the Shadowfell plane, the citizens of Thultanthar would become what we now call the Shadowvar, as the atmospheric effects of the plane of Shadow turned the humans of Thultanthar into darker, more twisted versions of their prior selves. Telamont also formed a closer relationship with Shar, the goddess who created the plane of Shadow, and Shadow magic, which was the magic of the Shadowfell plane, and this shadow magic became part of Thultanthar's way of life. In 1372 DR, so more than 1700 years after Karsus's folly, and only 120 years before the events in Baldur's Gate 3, Telamont finally decided to return the enclave of Thultanthar back to the material plane on Phaerun, bringing about the re-establishment of the Netheril Empire. This was always his goal, he was just waiting for the right time. In the late 1400s, the Netherese would become involved in a war against the nation of Cormyr, while also simultaneously fighting the Bedain of Anauroch. The Bedain were the humans who made the Anauroch Desert their home in the years following the Netherese Empire's destruction, and when Thultanthar returned 1700 plus years later, the Bedain did not exactly appreciate being oppressed by the Netherese, as they felt the desert was their land now. When the war with Cormyr came to an end, Telamont turned his focus to the elven city of Myth Drannor, and flew the Enclave over Myth Drannor's borders. Telamont wanted to seize the city's mythal, and a mythal is a very powerful, persistent magical field that actually changes how reality works. The mythal in Myth Drannor greatly protected the city, and it even allowed things such as the changing of weather at will and the creation of portals to other planes of existence. Telamont wanted to seize the power of the mythal and give it to the goddess of darkness, Shar, so Shar could displace Mystra as the new goddess of magic. If Shar could control the weave of magic, shadow magic would take over, and Telamont and the Shadowvar would grow in power. In Telamont's attempt to seize the mythal, he was stopped by a fellow Netherese, a lich named Larlock, who wanted to absorb the mythal himself. I could do an entire video on Larlock alone, but we already have so much information to absorb today. During this conflict, the Sage of Shadowdale, one of the most powerful and famous wizards in all the realms, Elminster, who was helping to protect Myth Drannor, killed Telamont. This caused the floating city of Thultanthar to fall upon Myth Drannor, and both cities were destroyed. The Netherese were once one of the most powerful magical civilizations in all the realms. Now their enclaves lie in ruins. Many spells, many artifacts, many magical devices come from this mostly ancient civilization, and there's no denying that the Empire of Netheril sent rippling effects throughout the realms. This video marks the 10th video in this Sunday lore series, so if you missed any of the previous videos, I will leave a link down below in the video description to that playlist.